The views expressed in this interview are those of the individuals and do not reflect the official policy or position of the U.S. government, the Department of Defense, the U.S. Navy, or the Naval Postgraduate School. For questions, comments, and suggestions, please email us at tridentroompodcasthost@nps.edu and find us online at nps.edu/tridentroompodcast. Welcome to the Trident Room, brewer of stout conversation, unfiltered and on tap. In today's podcast, NPS student Mike Morris sits down and has a drink with East Asian Policy Advisor Dr. Michael A. Glosny.
All right, well, today I'm sitting down with Mike Glosny, professor in the NSA department, China expert, and we're drinking some lagers in the Trident Room proper today. The last episode came to you from my backyard. We'll get some noise today as well. Maybe the ice maker or a plane flying over. I know you a little bit, tiny bit, but not really, I guess.
Yeah. So for the background, I had Mo in class, but last quarter was a Zoom class, so I know him from a little box on my computer screen, and this is the first time we're actually seeing each other
right.
from 6 feet away.
That's right. You could have been, an 8-foot giant or a 5-foot, two, little angry professor. I mean, who knows what I was going to face today?
Which one am I closer to?
Well, unfortunately, we're just the both of us are just such average people, aren't we? We're not memorable at all.
being both being named Michael doesn't start to stand out all that well, does it? Yeah.
No.
Yeah. So just very quickly, and then you can pull on whichever of these strings are interesting. Grew up in Chicago on the north side. City kid, Cubs fan. Ended up deciding to go to Cornell in upstate New York for college. Part of that drive was really wanting to have a different experience than city life, right? And Cornell is very, very different in terms of being far more remote, out in the middle of nowhere. A beautiful campus, which was very different from my experice of public transportation to and from school,
the L's and whatnot.
Yeah.
So I grew up in Illinois, but not Chicago. I said this to a class the other day: is when I'm saying I'm from Illinois, then somebody you're not from Chicago. Because if you're from Chicago, you say I'm from Chicago. If you're not, you say you're from Illinois. And so I'm from Illinois, which means not Chicago. But it's interesting, I think, that you're a Cubs fan, kind of, sort of. Maybe, but because you said you're from the north side. I feel like from being from Illinois, I at least know that I feel like White Sox fans are South Side Chicago, and that's like it. Like, I don't know where else White Sox fans live.
So it's changed a little bit.
Okay.
I mean, both in number and in location, right? I mean, and when I was born in the late 70s, and the White Sox were a non-entity for the most part in the city, and then they won the World Series, and now you sort of had a new generation.
Well, everyone loves a winner.
Exactly,
Yeah.
Exactly. Right.
We might what? Okay, do we call that bandwagoning or so?
Now I have the professor smile when the student correctly applies a concept that was taught in the previous quarter and does it properly. Very good. Very good.
What was your experience growing up?
Pretty middle class. My mom was a social worker. My dad was an office furniture salesman. We, for the first 8 years of my life, we were renters in a sort of two-story apartment, and then moved to a house in the mid '80s. I actually went to Chicago public schools for the whole time, but had the very, very, very fortunate experience of being put into gifted programs from pretty early on. So I kind of had the best experience imaginable in city schools. In
the city school system. Yeah. Did you did that kind of formulate some of your enjoyment or pull towards academics and academia? Because I mean, I don't know how you would describe yourself. Would you say you're a nerd of the geo-political?
I have a PhD from MIT. I can only be so far away from nerd.
Yeah. Fair.
So when I was younger, I was much more into sports. I was going to be the next shortstop for the Cubs.
Oh man,
I guess I would be too old and would have had to retire by now.
Call
but
back
that
to
was
Rasmussen's interview. He wanted to be a ball player growing up
exactly
too.
right.
How come
exactly.
I didn't want to be a ball player? What's wrong with me? Growing up in Illinois, not wanting to be a ball player.
Yeah, what's wrong with you?
Oh
Exactly.
my gosh.
And somewhere around 7th grade, I kind of realized, your chances of going pro are probably pretty minimal. You might want to, start studying and do better in school, and that will give you some opportunities.
Raise yourself up.
Yeah. And then, I just kind of flipped the switch. My certainly on the education side, my biggest influence is my mom, who pretty much the lasting memory that I have of her is just reading nonstop, right? Of just sitting on the couch late at night, reading and reading and reading. So I certainly got that bug and that influence from her. And then, as I said, I kind of flipped the switch.
Did you kind of start doing that a lot as a kid, like watching her and seeing how much she read, and that's sort of where it started?
And I read a lot as a kid.
What kind of books or readings did you do as a kid? Was it academic type studying, or was it like just fun books?
Yeah, when I was
just
young,
enjoying yourself.
It's kind of crazy because I read so little fiction now. But when I was a teenager, when I was younger, it was almost all fiction. The range of the great books we had. I still remember in our dining room the white bookcase that had just all kinds of books, and then in my bedroom I had several bookcases. That's not surprising if you go to my house.
So
if you go to my house now, pretty much there are bookcases all over the place.
I mean, I think even behind you in Zoom, that's our view. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. No, and then when you come into my office, when we can actually, really, really see each other, you will see wall-to-wall books and papers, and then I have more than that at home. When I moved from Boston to Washington, D.C., I had a buddy who was helping me put all the stuff in the U-Haul, and he says, "Glosny, moving you is like moving a small law firm."
What'd you do in D.C.? I mean, Boston, I assume, MIT years, and then you moved to D.C.?
Yeah, so I went from Cornell, then went to MIT for graduate school, and then after I finished at MIT, went to work at the National Defense University for a couple of years.
Okay.
Yeah.
What did you do while you were there?
So I did essentially a fellowship where I worked for the Center for the Study of Chinese Military Affairs, which is congressionally mandated and set up several years ago. And the director is Dr. Phil Saunders, who is just a fantastic colleague and role model. And, I had already at MIT started to learn more about the military, learn more about naval affairs. Actually came to NPS back in 2002 for some research that I was doing, but I was sort of already moving in that direction of learning all of the academic stuff that you need to know, but also being much more interested in the policy side of things and military affairs. And NDU was a great opportunity to spend a lot more time in the Pentagon, spend a lot more time at State, and kind of get a better sense of how things are going and what the rhythms of DC are like.
Did it give you a sense of kind of what the national thinking was as well, and so you could kind of focus your research areas, or did that influence you?
So I think what it was helpful for, and continues to be helpful to this day, is to try to figure out how taking my expertise as a China expert can be useful for people, right? What are the types of questions that they have? What's the type of information and analysis that I can really leverage my expertise and help them as they think about problems? So getting a better sense of how policy is made, what policy discussions are like, getting a better sense of how that consumption works, so that I can have a better sense of what types of projects can I work on and how can I present them in ways that are actually useful to people, not just, wow, you learned a lot and you thought big thoughts.
Thumbs up.
Yeah. Wow, there's lots of footnotes in that article. You must know stuff. That's
But what does that mean to the person reading it or the person you're presenting it to? So how do you translate all of this time and thought and knowledge into policy?
Right.
I had some commentary from an unnamed professor that a lot of the top programs right now are more policy focused, and so how do you suggest we do that? How do we translate our knowledge into policy?
Yeah, I mean, so what makes NPS and NSA special relative to lots of other schools, both political science departments and then kind of more international affairs, public policy places, is we take regional affairs really seriously. In a way that the rest of the field is moving in and we talked about this a little bit in Intro to IR, right? A lot of it is moving much more towards data, and thinking of, China is just a case in my data set, Russia is just a case in my data set, and it's all about generating new data and using more advanced statistical techniques, which makes sense as we're trying to understand patterns and generalizability and things like that. And whereas the rest of the field is going in that direction, right? I am someone who spent 2.5 years of graduate school on the ground in China, learning Chinese, interacting in Chinese, and
what years were those? When did you do that? You said in grad school?
Yeah. So what did I do? I spent the summer of 2001, the summer of 2002 in Beijing starting a language program. I'd started studying Chinese back as an undergrad. As it is the case for most things, I had a professor who just rocked my world. I took a course on international relations of East Asia. Not surprisingly, even with a pretty good education, I didn't know anything about Asia because you learn U.S. history, you learn European history. Maybe there's a reference to Mao somewhere in there. But,
right, if you remember it.
Yeah,
because,
right.
A lot of us, just do what I call data dumps, after a class, especially in high school or even undergrad. It's like, well, learned that, took that test.
Right. Yeah,
and it's gone.
Yeah, exactly. And took it, and it was really all about the Cold War experience in East Asia, taught by Tom Christensen, who then subsequently became my main advisor at MIT, then later went into the State Department as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State with responsibility for China, Taiwan, and Mongolia. So really, he just sort of lit that fire in me, and from there, he said, start studying Chinese language. Whatever you do in the future, knowing Chinese is going to be helpful. There's really no downside. So I'd started studying Chinese, started studying Chinese history, Chinese politics, all of kind of trying to round out that. And then when I got to graduate school, there's really not time built into your program to do language in addition to doing your coursework. Right. So think about from your experience, You have a year of doing DLI and then a year of doing coursework in graduate school.
Separate.
Right?
Separate entities.
Exactly.
We're given the time,
right.
And whoa, that's amazing. What a resource and opportunity.
Right.
Nobody just gets that.
Right.
Nobody else is given that.
Yeah.
But here through this program, we are.
Yeah. And then for most people, when you go to your PhD program, you're expected to take these courses, and if you want to take language classes, you're doing that in addition to the other classes, so you're not really devoted to it in the same sort of way. So in the summer of 2001 and the summer of 2002, I went over to China and spent probably 2.5 months there studying language.
So focusing on language, at what kind of level were you? Were you reading were you trying to study like upper level type materials, or were you still working on like conversational?
I was still intermediate to advanced, right?
Mm-hmm.
So sort of kind of second to third year in the way that languages are sort of taught in college, and that was helpful. But then you come back to classes, and then you're not. It's not an everyday thing. So whatever you learn, you talk about the data dump and things going out of your brain, kind of everything I learned in the summer gets pushed out when I'm not practicing it. So then I just realized, no, I need to focus, and spent 12 months doing an intensive language program at Tsinghua, which is kind of the equivalent of DLI, right? So the max class size was 3. So it's 3 students, and 5 hours a day of classes. It's very intense. It's you want to lose your mind, but different from DLI, right? I'm in the country. I want to go out and eat. I'm interacting with Chinese people.
You don't get to turn it off.
Exactly. Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. So I did that for 12 months. Then came back, working on my dissertation for a while. Then in 2005 to 2006, went over for another additional year where I was doing dissertation research, collecting materials. But then my language was good enough that I was able to sit in on master's level classes in Chinese, on Chinese foreign policy, on U.S.-China relations, and being, the sole white guy in the class gave me lots of opportunities for practicing my spoken Chinese, which was not great.
Lots of opportunities. Did you ever feel like maybe, it's like, oh, here's the infiltrator or something in our classroom, and if you're asking too many questions?
A little bit of that. I mean, I certainly got some strange looks from the students who weren't sure how to approach me or kind of what I was. But it was fun to have kind of the back and forth with them on different American views and Chinese views.
I was gonna say, it really gives you all the insight into how they view it, right?
Yeah.
So how did in those classes and maybe in your other experience, how does China view U.S.-Chinese relations?
Well, so this was 2005 to 2006. This was a period in U.S.-China relations where certainly relative to today, but in general, relations looked pretty good.
I was gonna say it looked far more optimistic at that point, right?
Yeah, there was a lot. I mean, we cooperated pretty well.
Pre-global financial crisis, and
right. But post 9/11,
right.
So we were both focused. The U.S. was both focused on other things, and then opportunities for cooperation on war on terror issues. This was actually a period when the U.S. and China were working pretty closely on North Korea issues. With the six-party, this is when the six-party talks was actually a useful thing and was making progress. Yeah, that's a long time ago.
Yeah,
for sure.
That is a long time ago. I mean, it's like a lifetime for me, and yet it's not. It's just, but it's like undergrad time for me. So it's just...
and kind of the worry at that point in time was on the Chinese side from the students that I was interacting with is, how long are you guys going to keep this up? Because at some point you're gonna not be focused on the Middle East, not be focused on Iraq and Afghanistan, and you're going to turn your attention back to us, and we know that you hate us and that you want to contain us and you want to keep us weak. When is that gonna happen again?
Yes. Well, what was U.S. policy at the time, or I guess pre 9/11 then, that made them think, oh, we're going to focus back on containment? Like, what was the U.S. doing that to them spoke containment?
Virtually everything that the U.S. does gets interpreted in the most negative light in a way that makes them believe that we have nefarious intentions, right? Any support for Taiwan, anything that we say nice about democracy. Yeah, and again, this was a period when in cross-strait relations, Chen Shui-bian and the DPP being in power, they were moving much more in a pro-independence direction, even in a way that was too extreme for the United States. So the United States ended up being pretty critical of Chen and being much more aligned with the PRC in their views of cross-strait relations. So it was a period where things were pretty stable. It was a period when China continued to be pretty responsible relative to what the concerns were of what China as a rising power might be. This is the period when China...
And of course it's natural for a rising power to view actions from the reigning hegemony to think like, oh, of course they want to contain us, you know. But you said it was more optimistic at the time. What changed then?
Well, so I mean, lots of things have changed since then. If you look at the last 10 years and the precipitous deterioration of the relationship, under President Xi especially, but some of this even started under Hu Jintao, China has become more revisionist in its views in its views, and then also in its actions, right? It has taken many more actions in maritime disputes, in global governance, in ways that are working at cross purposes with the United States and challenging regional interests. So there's definitely been a change in Chinese actions, Chinese approach, Chinese behavior that is a move away from that earlier period of being responsible, trying to reassure other actors,
friendly neighbors,
right. Yeah,
within
charm offensive, those sorts of
within the
words.
reigning international system,
Right.
So
Right.
I mean, I think they're pretty insistent that they want to be successful in the current system and don't want to replace it with a Chinese variant. But do you think that's sincere?
So I think it depends on your view on what your expectations were and then what it means to be revisionist, right? We talk about intentions a lot in international relations, and usually we talk about, are they benign intentions or malign intentions, right? I mean, it's political science, so we have to have a 2x2, and you can only have two choices.
What quadrant does it fall into?
Exactly.
There are no other explanations.
That I think when you think of a rising power, it is natural and normal for the rising power to want to change some things, to want to revise some things, to have more say, to have more influence, to have the nature of the regional and international order be more reflective of China's interests or of the rising power's interests. And the distinction that's probably more useful is not benign, malign, but between being a limited aims revisionist, right, or trying to revise some things, and then being kind of what Henry Kissinger would call a revolutionary, or a country that is really trying to replace and create a whole new international order, right? The distinction is, does China mostly want to keep the existing order in place that it has benefited from, but change some things about it to make China more important in that order? Or is China trying to blow up the whole thing and set up a whole other international order?
Which one is it?
I would say, so far, the evidence suggests that they are trying to do something closer to the former, right? Of certainly trying to become more influential in writing some of the rules within that international order, but not overturning it and not trying to completely replace it, right? Now the challenge and the problem becomes, is that too much, right? Is a limited aims revisionist still too much of a challenge?
Is it too sour of taste for
the
reigning?
For the U.S. to handle, right? Yeah,
yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. That I think, and then the other part of what has really changed the bilateral relationship is a consensus view that as a result of some of the things that China has done internationally, but also things that it has done domestically, we've had a complete rethink on what the approach to China should be, right? That since the Clinton administration, the idea of engaging China seemed to be dominant, right? And 5 or so years ago, people started to really question whether or not that was working, whether or not that was successful, and whether or not that should continue to be the policy. And certainly under the Trump administration, we have seen a move pretty far away from that focus on engagement. But we have seen, I think, a consensus view that there's a lot more questioning, is engagement the right approach?
Well, yeah. Did we see that engagement even in the international system? That I don't know how much success we were seeing for our intended outcomes. I mean, did we see like our approach failing maybe? And so it's like, hey, it's time to try something new because we're not getting anywhere.
Well, and I think part of this debate is a poor framing on what engagement was supposed to do, right? That on those who are especially critical of engagement frame it as a series of promises that were made about what the effect of engagement should be, and 2007, I think it was, Jim Mann wrote a book called The China Fantasy, which was really characterizing the promises of engagement, of being, we will engage with China, and as it grows, it will democratize. Right? And
it must be. If we're our friends and we're guiding them, we'll guide them on this path to enlightenment and democracy, right?
And I think there's a big debate about to what extent that was important in the initial framing of engagement. In my own view, the domestic transformation and democratization was not the focus of engagement. It was, and we hope this happens. Right? But what has happened is, under Xi Jinping, as we see, to whatever extent you saw any moves towards political reform under Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao, you see a complete backslide of that, and you see Xi Jinping consolidating power,
right,
emphasizing the party, all of the things that show that China is moving further away from what we hope for in terms of democratization.
Right, but of course we can't. That's not unique to China either. Over the last 5 to 7 years, hasn't that been a worldwide phenomena? Right, you could almost look to any country, just about,
and see backsliding.
Yeah, and look at consolidation of power. And
one of the drivers in the direction of this consensus of engagement having failed is what we see domestically of the promise of democratization not working. Therefore, we need to try something else. I think the core of engagement and the hopes of engagement were not about domestic change in China. It was much more about trying to shape China's behavior in the international system, right? Of trying to say, if we pull China in and it sees that it will benefit from this existing order, that will then affect its cost-benefit calculus of how much it challenges that order versus tries to support that order. And will also change the way China defines its own interests. And now that it's a part of that system and fully brought in, right? So much of this background is, we spent the Cold War really, really containing China and keeping China out of the United Nations, had trade embargoes on it, formed alliances that were really aimed at China. So this was a wholesale change in the approach to China. And what we have seen is a difference in assessment of how well that has worked, right? Those that are most critical of it, I think, had expectations that if we engage China, China's just going to do exactly what we want and not going to challenge anything and just going to be a pliant little schoolboy who will fall in line and do exactly what we want. And I think that was never a reasonable hope. Right, that China was always going to have its own say, especially as it got more powerful. But I think the question then becomes, as it becomes more powerful, is it really trying to overthrow and overturn that order, or is it trying to make changes in that order? Right, and again, I think it's much more that they're trying to make changes in that order, and those are changes that are not comfortable for the United States to make, right? We liked that order the last 60 years where we were in charge.
It.
Exactly. Right.
Because it was for our benefit.
Right.
Let's not split any hairs here. It's for us.
Right. And one of the phrases that's used in the policy world all the time is we need to deal with the China that we have, not the China we wished we had.
Right. I could see that. You could apply that lesson to other areas
exactly. Yeah, exactly. Right. Yes. Yeah.
So, do you think we're headed in a more, beneficial direction for United States foreign policy towards China? Is it too antagonistic? Is it how are they going to react? Where is it leading us?
Yeah,
I don't want to throw you into the prediction world, which we know is not our world in international relations necessary. We're more into explanatory power. Not necessarily predictive power, but he
learned that from me,
Yeah. But where is this going to drive us?
Yeah, and I think I can absolutely understand the frustration with the direction of the relationship and the direction of China, right? A belief that even by, I think, more fair and objective standards of what we hoped to accomplish, China's more aggressive behavior is making it really hard for those who really want to have a cooperative relation and want to continue engagement and think that that's the right way forward. It makes it really hard to make an argument of here is how this is helping, right? Here is how this is helping the United States. So the frustration is completely understandable. The desire to try something new is completely understandable. I think what we're lacking still is a more coherent strategic logic for what we're trying to accomplish and then how moving in this more hardline direction is going to accomplish.
So it's kind of like you kind of sense that we're missing an end game here for like our current relationship status.
Yeah, right.
I mean, we see in the national security documents, that China focus.
The era of
FBI
great power
director last week, a couple
yeah.
weeks ago, names China our greatest adversary or threat. CNO Admiral Gilday last week backed that idea up, in China focus. It does seem very escalating and adversarial right now. And so people who hope for cooperation and engagement are kind of losing outside maybe right now, yeah?
So Secretary of State Pompeo gave a speech not long ago that had a little bit of optimism in there, that it wasn't just all great power competition, all China's revisionist, all the Chinese Communist Party is evil, and we need to keep Chinese out of our universities and all that sort of thing. He did at least make a nod to recognizing what was kind of the fundamental view throughout the Bush and Obama administrations was, yeah, we have problems. We have areas where our interests aren't aligned. There are areas where China is causing problems. But we have so many common interests that we need to cooperate on so many issues, right? And I think most of the policy statements hadn't had that aspect of it. So I was somewhat heartened by Pompeo talking about that. Now the question is how you then manage that relationship where you disagree, you're becoming much more adversarial, is certainly going to have some spillover effects on whether or not you're able to cooperate, right? And the difficult, right? I mean, this is probably the most complex geopolitical relationship we've seen, certainly in the last century, of how you manage this problem is not easy.
Well, sure. I mean, 10, 15 years ago, we imagined a flashpoint around Taiwan, and now we can imagine probably 3 or 4 flashpoints or more with China.
Right.
I mean, what are some of those right now? Or
well,
they're all. I mean, Hong Kong. I mean, there's.
Yeah, I'm like, there's lots of. I mean,
issue.
there's. You say potential.
South China Sea.
You say potential flashpoints. There's several that are flashing right now, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you have what's going on with India on the border.
Oh wow, yeah. I forgot about that too.
Yeah,
I already forgot.
Right, exactly. Yeah, forgot about that one.
Here's people with like mallets with nails, like you think like old maces and like medieval weapons, because they've agreed not to have like firearms, like gunpowder, and you're like gunpowder revolution out the door. We're like, okay, we're just gonna fight and batter each other to death. Like, how gory is that? Like, we're just not used to that, are we?
So the flashpoints are much more regional. South China Sea, East China Sea, what's going on the Korean Peninsula, Hong Kong. The bigger challenge is not just regional, right? As China is becoming is a complete global actor and is now everywhere.
Yeah, I was going to drive towards that. They're not necessarily looking to be regional. They're looking to be global. Yeah. Aren't they?
Yeah, I mean, I teach Chinese foreign policy, and I will have students who spent time in Africa, spent time in Latin America, who say, yeah, the Chinese are everywhere. What's going on? I'm taking your class because I want to learn a little bit more about what's going on because the Chinese are everywhere. And that's a change, right? That's an adjustment for the United States to recognize that the number 2 power in the world is projecting economic power with potential geopolitical implications pretty much everywhere. Right, it is a challenger, it is a competition, but back to kind of the idea of lacking the strategic logic of understanding what's going on in our policy. We call it great power competition, but it's not clear what we're competing over.
That's what I was going to ask really quick. So, like, China's focusing on these areas and are everywhere, right? We're everywhere too, the U.S. is, but is China focusing in areas where we're not so present? And do those areas that China is in, does it represent a competitive threat to the United States? Or do you think they're trying to spur action? But I'm just coming up with this idea right now. Are they trying to spur action by the U.S. to be like, oh, maybe the U.S. will follow us into this area and expend more resources and stretch thinner? and try and level the playing field?
I mean,
what's going on?
for the most part, especially once you get outside of the region, it is more driven by economic considerations than it is a geopolitical calculus of let's look for the soft underbelly in Latin America as a way to put pressure on the United States.
So is the United States missing out in some of these economic and geopolitical areas that China has shown itself?
It is, but I think the way we are responding to it is putting those countries in a difficult situation, right? So we've been neglecting much of the developing world for a long time. As China is now throwing a bunch of money around the world, we now look at that and say, oh, wait a second, we don't like China expanding its influence around the world. So maybe we should also start trying to look into giving some more money for infrastructure as a way of responding to the Belt and Road Initiative. But the problem is, if we frame it as we're only responding to China and these countries need to choose China or the United States.
Well, China came here first and offered this up, kind of.
And
you've been ignoring us forever as a global power.
Yeah.
So what? Like, why are you here now?
Right.
Goodbye.
Thanks for joining us in the Trident Room. This episode was recorded on July 17th, 2020. For more information about today's guests and topics, please visit the show notes. The Trident Room has been brought to you by the Naval Postgraduate School, Alumni Association, and Foundation. For questions, comments, and suggestions, please email us at tridentroompodcasthost@nps.edu and find us online at nps.edu/Trident Room Podcast.